seminar series. On behalf of Workfare and Free, I'm really pleased to welcome you all on this latest session of our series called On the Move, Conversations on Labor and Migration. It's my pleasure that so many of you have gathered here today as we explore the history of informality or the informal sector in India. Before we begin with our seminar today, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce Workfare and Free. We are a knowledge institution based out of Bangalore, and the idea of our we're more a nascent organization, and we are incubated with the idea of our commitment to advance worker-centric knowledge and action, so that labor migration can become more secure and dignified. We attempt to bring together research and insightful policy work, try to bring also initiate teaching and training activities, which are all informed by our practice in the industrial clusters, as well as rural migration corridors in the rural areas. We're very pleased to have with us Professor Karuna Dietrich Wielenga. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name very correctly. Thank you for accepting our invitation and being here with us today. I just also want to sort of talk about the seminar series, which has been sort of conceived as a space to bring together scholars, labor practitioners and activists and researchers from different disciplines and fields who are working at the intersection of labor and migration and informality. And through this initiative, we really hope to open and encourage multidisciplinary dialogue so that we can discuss further on the evolving dynamics of migration and labor and understand the complexities of these themes and the challenges in both local and global contexts. We also, through these conversations, hope to highlight the lived realities of migrant workers and delve into the structural conditions that they navigate, which are all shaped by policies, histories, and the shifting economic landscapes. So we're very pleased in this context to host Professor Karuna this evening, and thanks again for being here. Professor Karuna's expertise is in economic and social history of South Asia with a focus on labor and informality. She explores these complex interactions between labor, capital, and state in various industries between the 1930s and 1970s. Professor Karuna has authored a monograph titled Weaving Histories, which explores the transformation of the handloom industry in South India from the 19th century onwards to the mid-20th century, and where she connects the micro and the macro. She also uncovers how this transformation affects the lives of different groups of weavers in South India. Her papers have been published in Modern Asian Studies, the International Review of Social History, among other journals. And we're very glad that her scholarship is sort of helping us also in deepening our understanding of the emergence of the informal sector in India today, which is the focus of her talk, where she also re-examines some of the contemporary debates about industrialization and economic development. So this talk is titled The Informal Sector in India, A Historical Perspective. And I'll leave it to Professor Karuna to go into the details, but why I would think this is very important is because in this talk, she questions the narrative of informality as the product of neoliberal globalization and sort of traces the roots of how the Indian state itself played a role in structuring informal work arrangements across various industries. I'm assuming she will take the case of her work of South India and the Madras presidency in illuminating this story for us. And I will request her to sort of share with us what were those specific historical factors around independence that she thought of were important in shaping the emergence of informality in India. We all know that the late 1940s was a very tumultuous period with a lot of labor strikes and momentous legislative and institutional changes happening around at this time, which Ravi Ahuja sort of describes as India's comprehensive political crisis. So I'm really looking forward to you to unpack this political crisis and how it led to the emergence of the informal sector in the 1940s or the later decades. And if I could just also ask you a question that you could perhaps reflect on, Professor Karuna, is why is it important to bring the state into this contemporary discourse of informality? So with these questions, the floor is open to you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I feel it's way more satisfying in many ways that one talks to an audience which is not, restricted to the walls of an academic institution, and especially people who are very much involved on the ground. So in a sense, it's quite exciting, and in a sense, one feels honored that that people on the ground, that we can have a conversation and learn from each other. I think those kind of connections are very important, and actually and so it's great that you have created a space for that. So thank you very much for having me here. So I have a PPT, and I will kind of go through it, but please feel free to stop me at any time and ask me, because I know that this is different from an academic seminar kind of space. So please feel free if you want a clarification, or you want me to go off in a different direction, then that's also fine. But for now, I have a kind of PPT, and I'll go through that. Okay, so I'll first share my screen.
Thanks, Professor Karuna. We'll go through your presentation, and then we can perhaps open the floor for conversation and discussion.
Sure. And you can also, I'll try to address especially your last question.
Sure.
Of why think about all this. But please remind me also at the end to
Sure.
to it. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay. 1 minute. As I said, I'm a little bit. Where is that?
If the audience or participants have any questions during the talk, please feel free to put it on the chat box, and we can also bring it up towards the end of the talk.
Yeah. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah. And is it showing slide?
Not yet.
Screen? Not yet. I don't know why it's not opening into full screen. No idea. Earlier it did. No, it's not.
Do you want to try the slide option?
That's what I'm doing, slideshow.
Huh.
But it's somehow not. Okay. Let me try it the other way around. Let me first do slideshow. No, that doesn't work. Oh yeah, okay. I think I know what I have to do. Share. Okay, and then. Okay, I think now it's okay.
It's visible.
Great. Okay. Sorry for the input.
No worries.
Okay. So I'll first begin with, how the informal sector is kind of defined and looked at, right? So, the informal sector as a concept, as a category, kind of emerges in the 1970s with Hart, describing markets and livelihoods in Africa, since then, so many decades have passed, and economists, sociologists, so many people have debated and discussed, and so now we have a more comprehensive kind of understanding of the informal sector, but still, there are different ways, and depending on the context, depending on what you're trying to discuss, often the emphasis emphasis on how you define the informal sector is different, right? So, so I've just listed here a few kind of contrasts or different ways of how it has been conceptualized. So on the one hand, especially in the beginning decades, the informal sector was seen as this march, and the typical the typical form of production under capitalism was the large factories, the organized sector, and the typical labor relationship within that was the standard labor contract, right? And wherever that didn't exist, the kind of idea was that, oh, these are just remnants of the past, and things haven't gone the way they should have gone. But ultimately, they will get there, right? So it's something that will disappear, this informal sector. So that was a kind of early assumption. Whereas later on, and especially now, it's kind of, I think, fully understood that the informal sector is not necessarily something outside capitalism or a remnant from pre-capitalist past, but it's a very much an integral part of capitalism, right? And the work of Mariami, so many people has shown how capital accumulation and profit making and all are integrally happen where the informal sector is kind of fully tapped into this system of capital accumulation. So another kind of contradiction on when one looks at how do you understand the informal sector is the definition between, say, looking at it as a sector and looking at it as an employment relationship, right? So, so often when you try to categorize what is formal, what is informal, you look at the type of enterprise, right? So, does it pay taxes? Is it, does it come under different laws set up by the state? And how big is it, right? So there are all these classifications as to the size of the enterprise and so on. And depending on that, you place it in whatever sector. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is whether the workers in those, how many workers are there, right? And depending on the number, are they protected by labor laws or not, right? So that becomes another parameter by which you categorize industries. And a third way of looking at it has been is often when you use the word organized or unorganized sector, which is often used interchangeably with formal and informal sector. It is, are the workers unionized or not? And the idea is that only workers in large factories and large scale sector are unionized, while workers in small scale are unorganized, right? So these are kind of three ways, and as you can see, some of it is based on sector and the other is based on employment relationship, right? So protection of or lack of it, example, is employment relationship, right? So there are these multiple ways of how the informal sector is understood, and connected to that is, how the informal sector has been in some ways visualized. So while Holmstrom early on looked at the formal sector as the citadel, with the informal sector, so high up, protected in the citadel, and the rest of the plains around it as the vast informal sector. So in a sense that they are opposites and that they are independent of each other, right? Whereas someone like Jan Bremen looked at it more like, lots of hills in the middle of the plains, right? So it's not one citadel, but rather they are interconnected, the formal and the informal, right? And these boundaries are not rigid, right? So this, and then going back to the sector and employment distinction, now it is more widely recognized that the formal and the informal are actually, interconnected, and increasingly we find so many. So the ILO has also kind of highlighted that, perhaps it's more important to look at the employment relationship rather than the sector, because today in very huge industries and large scale sectors, you have highly vulnerable, unprotected kind of employment relationships, right? So the informal within the formal, so to say. So, okay. And then finally, another important parameter through which the informal sector is understood, or people try to understand it, is through the role of the state, right? So the informal sector is often has been seen as a space where the state is absent. So historically, also there is, people, labor historians who've been dealing with early period like Andrews and so on will kind of have argued, or Peter Robb have argued, that the informal sector was that part of the economy which the state couldn't access, right? It did not have the power, or it did not have the infrastructure to access, and therefore the state is absent there. And even now, I mean, we look at the informal sector as that part where the state has no control, so to say. It doesn't regulate that space, right? Instead, it is regulated by social institutions such as caste, gender, and religion. So this has been a kind of general understanding, both in contemporary as well as when one looks at things historically. Now, given this given this kind of understanding, what I am going to try and do today is look at the informal sector historically, right? And also, just adding to this, I haven't put it here, but adding to this is the thing that's, so the concept of the informal sector emerges in the 1970s. And now with the spread of neoliberal globalization, and with the expansion of informality and the decline of the standard employment relationship globally, and even in the industrialized West, there is a kind of clear connection between this new form of capitalism and informality, right? So there is no doubt that even in India, informality has expanded and formal sector has declined, right, in terms of number of workers, in terms of industries, all of that. So there's no doubt about it. And therefore, one kind of associates informality as something very recent, right? Or, since the 1990s. And however, so in this in this presentation, I want to kind of challenge that, not to say that there is no connection between neoliberal globalization and informality. Of course, under neoliberal globalization, informality has become the standard, so to say, and it has expanded. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't there before. And one needs to look at other aspects as well if one wants to understand informality and its roots in India. Because if one wants to tackle it in the present as well, if we keep focusing only on neoliberal globalization, then perhaps we fail to see certain other areas in which we need to bring about change, right? Which we need to address, right? So some of my key arguments are going to be, one, that the informal sector is neither a remnant of the past, mere remnant of the past destined to disappear, nor is it just a phenomenon of neoliberal globalization, right? So it is very much integral to the way capitalism took shape in India. And to understand this, we need to look closely at the decades around independence, when many key aspects of our economy and polity were crystallized. And in this whole process, so I really feel, we need to go back to, obviously we need to go back into history, and it's useful to go back even deeper into history. But for the case of India and the Indian economy, I think the decades of the 1930s to the 1970s are very important, because in many ways, economic policies, laws, so many things get crystallized in that period. Obviously, in the 90s, there are important shifts. But the very fact that our labor laws have, been the same from the 40s till the present. And though now the new labor codes have come into place, but to understand that, I think we really need to go to that period when they were crystallized. And in this process, the third argument that I make is that the state, far from being absent, was quite central to the creation and sustenance of the large informal sector in the Indian economic landscape, right? So today we understand that the informal sector is absolutely, and unlike so many other economies, in the Indian economy, the informal sector is so central to it. So if we want to understand this bulking of the informal sector, then we need to go back to this period and look at the kind of decisions that were made by the state, both in the realm of economic policy as well as in the realm of legislation, and especially labor legislation. My work, I try in my own work to connect the micro to the macro. So what I'm going to present now is based on a very detailed study of labor in the Madras presidency, right? And also, just to add to that, it is not just that, because that one needs to study the micro, but when we look at labor, we all know that labor is is legislated both by the state and the center. So many of the labor laws are specific to the states, right? And therefore, it is important to understand the regional differences also. And I'll come back to this at the end. When it comes to economic policy also, while the 5-year plans and central economic policies are important, we also find that regional policies are important, right? So the way Tamil Nadu's economic policy is very different from Bihar's economic policy. So if you want to understand the economy and labor in India, then we need to do detailed regional studies as well, and then bring it back to the macro picture. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm looking at the Madras presidency, which for those who are not familiar with it, it included all of Tamil Nadu, parts of Kerala, which is Malabar, the northern part of Kerala. It included a part Kannara, which is the coastal Karnataka, Mysore. It did not include the Mysore state, but around the Mysore state. So it included several districts, Kadapa, and it included several districts in what is today Telangana, Andhra, and all the way actually to one of the districts which is today in Orissa. Okay, so it was a very large presidency. So this figure is actually made from data which is as of even now we have less data about the informal sector than about the formal sector, right? So you can imagine in the 1940s it was much worse. So there is very little data based on which one can really draw substantial conclusions, but one can get impressions at least, right? So this is based on a report which actually draws on census data, and it is put up by the by the Commissioner of Labor, and so it shows the number of non-powered factories vis-a-vis the number of registered factories. Okay, so here this data is collected in the context of the Factories Act. So here is a breakup, and again, I wouldn't say that we have to believe every number in this, but it just gives you because, for example, it is not entirely clear how handloom weaving is counted. Are they counting the number of weavers, which I think they are not, because the number given here, sorry, I think it's not visible on the screen, but the number given here is some 42,000 something and all that. But if you look at the number of looms in the same period, it's way more than that. So it's not clear, are they counting number of kind of small workshop factories, or are they counting individuals, right? In some cases, it's not very clear. In other cases, it's clear that they're actually counting units, workshops or units. But what it gives you a sense of is that like today, there was lots of different kinds of production that were going on, and the what we call the informal sector was way bigger than the what we call this formal sector, right? Also, then if you take a closer look at how were these, I mean, how did these production units look? Then here is an example of a beadi making establishment in 1946. So it again comes from another report on the beadi industry. So there were 1,656 establishments were counted, of which there were 386 which employed more than 100 workers. Then there were a large number of establishments, unfortunately we don't know the exact number, which employed between 50 to 60 workers, and the remaining employed just very few workers, right? And now the beadi industry is very, very interesting, and I will come back to the beadi industry later on, because in this period, and the beadi industry is very much at the center of this tension between the formal and the informal. So in this period, it is not that the beadi industry is happening in the homes of people like what we are used to, and it is not that women are the main workers in the beadi industry. At least in Madras Presidency, you have many, slightly large scale kind of units coming up, and there is a tendency towards making these units larger and larger. Okay, so and many men are employed. It is not that more women are employed, right? It is only in the coming decades, that is from the 50s onwards, that actually the manufacturing moves into the homes, and all these larger units get broken down into much, much smaller units. Okay, and so this kind of process of informalization and in many ways feminization is not something natural, right? And it happens in response, or in response to the to what the state is doing, and as an outcome of the I would say the political the political conflicts between employers, employees, so the capital, labor, and the state, right? So the outcome it becomes actually greater informalization, right? And so that's what I'm going to kind of slightly map out also here, try and map out. So if one looks at the workforce, so the establishments I have kind of indicated. So in handloom also, you actually find, like the beadi industry, you find there are people who are working in their homes. There are workshops that are coming up. There are small factories that are coming up. And there is a tendency that, that these are becoming slightly larger in scale. However, again, similar to the beadi industry, there is a kind of halting of this, if one would like to see it as a kind of formalization process, right? So coming to the workforce, a lot of them were piece rate workers, especially in the artisanal industries. So whether it was beadi, handloom, different kinds of, other kind of artisanal work, it was they were paid based on the on their output. In the service industries, for example, in hotels or shops, etc., many of them were daily wage workers, so they were paid per day. There were very, very few who were on monthly wages, right? And similarly, one can also find that there was a, division. I mean, that the labor market was divided and the workforce was divided often based on caste, religion, or gender. So you would find that in the leather industry was predominantly pariah. In the handloom industry, you would find different weaving castes. But I would I don't have time to go into it now. So, but what I mean is not that this was kind of rigid, but often the labor market was segmented, but these segmentations also moved. So as I already gave an example, the beadi industry was male and then it becomes female, right? So similarly, in the handloom industry, you can see that, the caste composition kind of changes over time also, and even in the leather industry. So I don't have time to go into it in detail now, but let's not imagine these as kind of rigid segmentations, but there are segmentations which kind of shift for a multiplicity of reasons. Okay. And also to give, so all this is just setting the context. To give more context, we are, and going back to one of the definitions that I said of the formal and the informal sector, we assume that the informal sector are people who are unorganized, who can't be organized, right? However, as already Geeta pointed out, the 1940s, and as Ravi Ahuja has pointed out, the 1940s and especially the late 1940s were a time of labor upheaval, right? And labor was a very much politically present in this period. So these are just, you can see headlines from the time. Today, we don't see headlines of workers' strikes or in our newspapers. And the interesting factor is that it is not just workers in the big factories. It is true that the strongest unions were in the large scale industries, especially railways, for example, or the textile industry. However, unionization was quite prevalent in other sectors as well. So here, this is just data from one particular year, 1948. I'm sorry, I don't know whether you can see the title at the top, because I can't see it. The Zoom is covering it. But so this shows all the different strikes, or not actually strikes, but industrial actions, right, by workers, which has been documented in one of the state files. So you can see that it is not just textiles, right? Workers in textiles who are protesting, whereas people in BD, handloom, printing press, scavengers and municipal workers, hotel workers, rice and oil mills, name it, and you find that workers are organizing, are challenging. So I don't have time to go into unionization and all that, but so this is not to say, though, be romantic about it and say, oh, how great they were all mobilizing, but because those unions were fragile, it was not easy to mobilize in the informal sector, but just to make the point that they were also there, right? And they were mobilizing. So these are just some images. So this is from a union meeting by tannery workers in Trichy in 1948. And this is a photo of all the volunteers for a huge gathering in the riverbed of Vaigai. There are amazing descriptions of this gathering, where thousands of handloom workers, handloom weavers, women with children in their tottils, were occupied the dry riverbed of the Vaigai in Madurai, right? Okay, so, and here is again another example, just to give you a glimpse. This is just, the unions registered in Madras, just a selection. It's not all the unions. So every year, then the state collects information, right? So this is again 1948. These are some of the new unions that were registered in that year, right? So you can see what interesting kind of, Metal Box Company Employers Union, Vellore Katpadi Jatka and Bullock Cart Labor Union, right? So so this is just to give you an impression. So just to kind of recapture, we have seen the landscape of the economy of production, right, where the informal sector is very large. We have kind of seen what kind of units were there, right? And we have seen that workers were also kind of collectively mobilizing around different issues. Okay. Now, so now I'm going to look at mainly I'm going to look at how what the state is doing in this period. Okay, so looking at legislation, and then later I will look at economic policy also. So here, my timeline here starts with 1937, but actually it should start a little before. So it should start with 1930. So in 1928, the Royal Commission on Labor is set up, and it does a huge investigation and comes out with this report of the Royal Commission on Labor. And in that report itself, there is a whole section on non-powered factories. And it says how this is a very large sector, and how it is unregulated, and that there is a need for regulation. Now, in 1932, in the Madras Presidency, there is a private members bill that is introduced to regulate artisanal kind of workshops. Okay, so this is one private member introduces this, and he himself comes from one of the Vishwakarma castes, and he introduces this bill, but it is not entertained. It is said this is all not feasible and all this can't be done. The state doesn't have the infrastructure, so it's not even considered. It's dismissed. So then we come to 1937, where large non-power factories such as the BD, tanning and handloom establishment are declared as factories under the Factories Act of 1934. And why is this done? It is in response actually to union demands, right? It is not like suddenly the state thinks that, it should be doing this good deed, but it is because there is pressure, political pressure saying, these kind of large factories, just because they don't employ power, doesn't mean they are not entitled to labor protection given by labor laws, right? So it is included into the Factories Act. However, there is a pushback from the employees, and therefore in 1939, this notification is withdrawn. Okay, and if you read the notes of that period, then they say, oh, these factory owners are not cooperating, they're refusing to get registered. They, if we go for an inspection, they just close shop and disappear, and they reopen somewhere else, right? So there is this thing of inability of monitoring or of keeping track, and therefore, it's better we just withdraw this notification. Now, soon after that is obviously the Second World War, and so during the Second World War, we have the Defense of India rules, right, which mandates compulsory arbitration for everybody. And here it is very necessary to say that our whole labor law regime owes a lot to the Defense of India rules, and this whole thing of tripartite, more than tripartite, the whole thing of compulsory adjudication and our Industrial Disputes Act has its roots in the Second World War and the Defense of India rules. So then in 1947, then after the war, we find, so during the war, again, actually, there is an expansion of the small scale industry, something that I will come back to, because there is an increased war demand. And again, there is a difference of what happens in Madras Presidency and in other places, but there is especially in the Madras Presidency, there is an expansion of the small scale industry, right? And soon after the war, obviously the war demand is no longer there, and so there is so there is a crisis, right, of employment, and there is a crisis of inflation, all sorts of things. It's a period of economic crisis, and so there is again a lot of labor unrest. There is a lot of the strikes and agitations increase, right? And so at that peak time, several courts of inquiry are set up on all these different industries, on BD, handloom, tannery, etc. And there are recommendations are made to increase wages, provide bonus, and also bring them under some form of regularization, right? And the unions are also demanding that once the reports are out, the unions are saying, listen, this is what has been said, and therefore, we need to have legislation, right? However, these inquiry commissions do not have any decision-making power, right? So then what happens is that but because this pressure is building up, in 1947, several acts are passed. So one is a central act, which is the Industrial Disputes Act, but just before that, two other very significant acts are passed, which is the Madras Non-Power Factories Act and the Madras Shops and Establishments Act. So I will talk a little bit about the Madras Non-Power Factories Act and the Madras Shops and Establishment Act if we have time, okay? And if there are questions, then I can talk about that. But these were very significant because, as I said, it's because of the pressure from below that they are introduced. But then the kind of debates that happen around these two laws in the assembly and outside in the newspapers is very, very illuminating. And in many ways, we can hear echoes in the past as to the kind of debates that are happening today, for example, around gig workers. So I'll show you some of these debates, and I mean, perhaps you will pick up, lots of things where you might think, oh wow, you can just cut, paste, and put it in today, and it will sound exactly the same, right? So, I'll talk about that in the next few slides. But first, I'll kind of present the larger timeline to you. So, in 1949, what happens is that the Non-Power Factories Act is actually withdrawn after being introduced, because the reason that is given is that the center has passed another act called the Factories Act 1948, and though there was a mismatch, the 1949 Non-Power Factories Act actually was a little bit more liberal than the Central Factories Act, in that it covered all units which employed at least 10 workers, right? So, I mean, people here will know that the Factories Act covers factories which have 10 workers if they are using power, and if they are not using power, then the minimum is 20 workers, right? Whereas the Non-Power Act covered non-power factories with 10 workers, right? So smaller units were covered by the act. So despite this change, what they did was they decided that no, we will do away with this act, and instead, we will do some tinkering with the Factories Act, and we will include all these smaller non-power factories, right? Those who employ between 10 and 19 workers, we will get them covered by the Factories Act. Now, all that backfires and actually doesn't happen, because the employers get their act together, they go to court, and they stall that process, okay? So the High Court, as you can see below, so the High Court kind of declares this attempt by the Madras government to kind of include all factories employing between 10 and 19 workers as factories. It kind of declares it void, right? And therefore now they are only factories with more than 20 workers can claim any protection from the Factories Act. Okay, I'm sorry, there is something with this that you can't see some of the writing. But the other thing that the state does is that so from 1947-48 onwards, you have this gamut of laws, right? So you have the ID Act, you have the Madras Shops and Establishment Act, and then the Madras Non-Power Factories Act is gone. But in you have these acts, and then if you try to unpack how were these acts implemented, you find how, in the coming years, these acts are continuously diluted, right? So much so that that they end up excluding a large section of the workforce, right? So I'm not sure I'll be able to go into full detail of the acts, but if there are questions, then I can go into the full details of the acts. But basically, what happens is that if you study how these acts were passed and then how they were implemented, you find two things. One, that even when the acts were passed, they were passed with huge loopholes in them, right? They were made vague, and all this won't sound surprising to you. It will resonate a lot with the kind of laws that we generally pass. It's a characteristic of our labor legislation that things are not defined clearly, right? And it will be said that it will be defined in the rules, and then it will be said that, or it will be left to the discretion of the labor court judge or the High Court judge to determine what does this particular category mean, right? So what does a worker mean? So very key things are left undefined, and huge loopholes are left within the law, loopholes through which you can even drive a bus. And this is not surprising. I will show you some of the debates in the Legislative Assembly. They are not doing this by mistake or unaware, right? They're doing it purposefully, and it is being pointed out to them that, listen, the way you are making this law, this is what will happen, right? And that is what finally happens also, but they still go ahead with it, right? So that's one. The second thing is, if you look at the way these laws are implemented, right? So for that, you really need to unpack the everyday, the everyday in the labor courts, so to say. So how workers go to court, and then how, their cases drag on for 3 years, 2 years, and then you find the kind of arguments that employers put forth, and then you find the judgments, often contradictory, which slowly make their way up to to the Supreme Court, right? And then you also see the kind of lobbying that happens around these laws and for further dilution of these laws, for asking for further exemptions of these laws, which are gradually done, right? So for example, here, I mean, I've just given this example that by 1953, so initially what happens is that even when the law is passed, immediately all government establishments are exempt from the law, right? And then there are petitions which say, but how can you have hospitals and nursing homes? These are life-giving spaces. If here you start controlling and nurses and health workers start demanding rights and all that, then everything will collapse, right? So they have to be exempted, right? So they are exempted. Then lawyers chambers say, but how on earth do you mean that my chaprasi can now come and say about leave and about timings and all these things? How will lawyers chambers function, right? Okay, sorry, okay, then we have to exempt you as well, right? So you can see the whole list. So nursing homes, hospitals, registered chartered accountants and auditors, income tax practitioners, educational institutions, hostels. So the list grows and grows and grows, who are all exempt from the Madras Shops and Establishments Act, right? Finally, by 1953, and you can literally see the kind of lobbying that happens. By 1953, all persons employed in handloom establishment on contract basis and paid on piece rate basis are exempt. Family-run shops and establishments are exempt. Those employing not more than 3 workers are exempt. Those workers employed on a contract and piece rate basis in any shop or commercial establishment are exempt. So you can see that by 1953, practically everybody is exempt, right? So except, the large commercial, so for example, the LIC or large Parry and Company, not the workers, but the office staff of the Parry and Company, or large establishments like them, only they can use the MSC Act. While initially that was now not how it was envisioned, right? So this is the timeline where you can see how these laws get totally diluted till the large section of the workforce is exempt from any kind of protection. So this is part, and in order to understand why is this happening, why is this lobbying successful, right? Why is it that when handloom employers get together and write a petition, or when tannery owners get together, or when BD owners get together and write petitions and lobby the government, why are they successful, right? So it's not that they're always successful, and I'm not trying to, paint a very clean picture. You find, for example, very interesting, what would you say, very honest labor commissioners who are actually standing up for workers. You come across those characters. You also come across politicians who are standing up for the workers, right? But the balance is skewed. And in order to understand why that is so, one has to also understand that this was the period of the new independent nation, right? And the government at the center and at the state was trying to convince everybody that this is the time for nation building. It's not a time for, conflict between capital and labor. You have to set aside your differences, and we all need to come together to build the nation. And that is the history of how the the Congress trade union, the AITUC is split, right? And the Congress comes up with its own trade union, right? So this is the larger context that we need to understand. And so here are some of the quotes. I'm not going to read them out. You can perhaps read them for yourself. But you can see that, apart from this whole thing of nation building, and which means, building a strong economy, there is also this idea of, sorry, how much time do I have? Do I stop?
Maybe another 10 minutes.
Okay, fine. That's enough for me. Okay, so, but there is also this whole, especially at the regional level, and this is the reason why I say that, you have to look at the center and at the region, because when you go and read the records of the center, for example, you find like the 5-year plans and whatever, you find the whole narrative is around large scale industry, right? But when you come and look at the region, you find how the small scale industrial sector was also very, very crucial, right? And while these bills are being discussed in the assembly, the narrative is, listen, how can you bring these laws into these small scale sectors? It will destroy the sector itself, right? So the province of Madras is a home of cottage industry, right? So the and the owners or the small capital within these industry are seen as the as the small man, so to say, who needs protection, right? And not labor, right? So if you want to protect the industry, that means you protect the industry from labor laws. So you prevent labor laws from being implemented, because it is presumed will destroy the industry, right? So this is the kind of narrative that is built, right? So here are some more quotes. So and here again you will find echoes that where all these strict labor laws means you will not attract capital will run away, it will go somewhere else, right? And so on. Now, you also find glimpses of how they are building in the loopholes, right? So, for example, here the government have the safety valve here is that they can exempt a person or class of persons from the operation of this law, right? So, as I said, they are not doing this, without awareness. They are doing it on purpose, right? They're building in the safety valves within it. So that is why the laws are left vague, that you can define things as you like, and you can always have the power of exemption, right? And which we see that unfolds, that one by one, everybody is exempt, right? So and then this talk, I'm just giving you some of the quotes. So that the economy here builds relies not on the big employers in the presidency, but the small shopkeepers who employ a few men only, and for whom they are already very generous, right? And then there is a whole narrative of how workers are generally lazy and that they need discipline, and what will they do with so many holidays, right? So so you can you can read some of these quotes. Maybe I'll give you a couple of minutes to read these quotes, but it's okay to be carried away with enthusiasm, but you need discipline, and this whole thing that that small scale industry is the backbone of the economy, right? And it needs these are all men of self-reliance, self-effort. And so I do not see why the government, instead of coming to their rescue, should propose measures restricting the scope of industry, right? And so on. So and also saying this, that our economy is not ready for these kind of laws, right? So after some years have elapsed, the country has reached a certain stage of development, then maybe we can think of all this, but we really can't afford it now. And here is Chief Minister Rajagopalachari saying, the whole of this business, as far as I am able to see, depends upon home labor, and if factory laws are applied, it would create great distress, right? Now and here there is something that I will come back to very briefly, which is that in a lot of this discussion, gender plays a very important role, right? So in this particular discussion, they're actually discussing the BD industry, and they're saying, if you start regulating, are you going to regulate inside the homes? Are you going to regulate women? Women will lose their the little income that they are getting. So you should not bring in these regulations, because in that by doing that, you are actually harming the women, right? So women don't need protection of law, but they need protection from law, right? And then there is also another narrative of how most of these workers are actually not really workers, and that I will come back to. But just connecting it back to, so in the regional economy in the Madras presidency, you can see this whole talk about small scale industry and its absolute centrality to the economy, and therefore bringing in labor laws or protection for workers will harm it, and it is a time for nation building. And this is connected to the larger narrative of nation building, right? So on the left, I have given this advertisement, which is saying that we should protect, we should support Kudisai Tolil, which basically means cottage industry. Actually in Tamil, it literally means hut industry. So celebrate your Deepavali, and by doing that, you please support cottage industry, and but the larger thing is that it is connected to the larger narrative of nation building, right? So when we go back to the larger narrative of nation building, what we find is that though the first 5-year plan largely ignored the small scale sector, with some Gandhian ideas being given some special kind of outlets, largely the small scale sector is absent. But by the time you come to the second 5-year plan, you see that the small scale sector is recognized as a crucial employment provider, right? And it is seen that the big large scale sector is going to take time, and therefore the small scale sector needs to be given a boost as well. And so what they do is that they start reserving a lot of production for certain goods. So for example, matches are reserved for small scale production. So many other things are reserved for small scale production, right? And the SOP that is given is basically that, you will not be subject to labor laws and you will be given other kinds of support, right? So that is the kind of deal, right? And in the middle of all this, as I said, so this is the larger. Sorry, I'm going a little bit back and forth in the sense of, because these are many pieces of the puzzle that kind of need to fit together, right? So on the one hand is the whole, the existing landscape, the way workers are mobilizing, the demands that they are putting forth, okay? On the other hand is economic policy, right? Both at the center and at the regional level, which are slightly different, right? And the kind of lobbying and the demands that is being made by small scale capital as well, which I think we need to pay attention to. Okay, so this is kind of another piece of the puzzle. And the third piece of the puzzle is in terms of labor laws and other kind of legislation, what the state is doing. And so there I have kind of shown you this trajectory where, because of pressure from below, there is an attempt to create certain labor laws and to bring in what today we call the informal sector also into these protective legislations. But then there is a pushback, right? And this pushback is both, I mean, at the time of these laws being formed and also in their stages, in their implementation, right? There is a gradual kind of dilution of these laws, so much so that, one can argue that there is a kind of crystallization of those who get to be protected and those who are left out without protection, right? And one of the key ways that this kind of happens is both in the labor courts and in the kind of lobbying that is happening. Okay, so in order to gain any kind of protection from these laws, whether it is the ID Act or whether it is the Madras Shops and Establishments Act or the Bonus Act or any of these acts, you first of all need to be recognized as a worker. And the first thing, if you look at all these laws, you will find that the way that the worker is defined in each of these laws is different, right? So whenever you find employers immediately rushing to the court, that's the first thing they do, right? If they are challenged, or if the workers go to the industrial tribunal, for example, the first thing that they do is they immediately rush off to the high court because they have the means to do so. And the first thing that they challenge or they argue is that, oh, these are not workers, they are not employees, right? And then they set out a whole gamut of reasons why they are not employees, right? So I will show you some here. These are some, I'll go back to the previous slide, but here are some of the arguments that are put forth, right? So for example, weavers saying, oh, these weavers, they're piece rate workers, they come as they please, they go as they please, right? They work on piece rates, they actually buy yarn from us and they sell back the cloth, so we have a contract with them, so they're not our workers, right? Or or they are people who are, so for example, in the Arecanet business, large number of women are employed, right? And there's a very interesting case study of the Arecanet, so which I can't go into the details, but basically this is it is not a small, I mean, it is not a what do you say, self-consumption kind of industry, right? This is areca nuts which are being processed in order to be exported. So it's an export industry, but a lot of the processing is happening in backyards, right? And women are being employed for this. And when all this case goes to court, and then there are also many lobbying letters, the argument is that these women are doing all this for pastime, right? And they are only doing it because they have deft fingers, right? And they will earn a few rupees. They are actually not workers. This is all pastime kind of work that is being. So they're not at all workers. So, why would you give them the protection? And you have a labor minister who goes, visits, meets all these women and comes back and says, how on earth could you argue that these are factories and that these women are workers, right? They are very happy with whatever is going on. And so, so that case is killed, right? Though the labor commissioner is against it, the case itself is killed, and all these Arakanat processing units are exempt from the law, right? So you can see how, this battle around the definition of the worker. And I think going back to Geeta's question, you will find these battles together today with gig workers. I remember just today reading in the newspaper that, this whole idea that, they are not workers, right? They are, partners, they are this, they are that, but they are not workers. So it seems to me a very, very old argument. And so this is used very actively to draw these lines of exclusion, right? And gender, I think, plays a key role in this process. So to give just another example, women in the choir industry were termed as casual or faltu. I mean, this is a word that is used, right? Faltu labor. So all these kind of processes are used to kind of draw these lines of separation. And so, I mean, so basically my main argument is that in this period between the 30s, 40s, and 50s, one sees this whole process through which there is a kind of division. I wouldn't call it a rigid separation of the formal and the informal. They are all interconnected, right? And I am not arguing that this wall that was created, that it wasn't a wall, but whatever separation was created, that it's remained rigid and from then on, no, right? But it was an important time when a lot of things got crystallized, right? And the struggle continued. It is not that then handloom weavers and BD workers stopped mobilizing or they stopped challenging these laws. The battle continues. You find in 1950s, a BD Act is passed, and then again in 1960s, another BD Act is passed. Hotel Workers Act is passed, right? So the battle continues on the street, in the assembly, and in the courts, right? However, if we want to understand all that happens after that, I think we need to go back to this period and kind of understand what is happening, right? So just to conclude, the informal sector is not just a residue of older forms of labor regulation lying out of reach of the state, right? So here you can clearly see that the state is not somebody who's helpless and sitting outside, right? Rather, the state played a very active role in ring fencing of unorganized labor and creating a whole sector where small capital could be almost a law unto itself. And here I'm borrowing the term used by Barbara Harris White. So if social institutions such as caste and gender, rather than the state, regulated the informal sector and capital labor relations, such a situation was created with the complicity of the state, and through its laws and policies, actions and inactions, it helped segment the labor market along lines of caste and gender. Now, here, when I'm arguing about the state being very much a part of this whole process, I'm drawing on earlier arguments of Prabhu Mohapatra, right? So he kind of looks at the 19th century and the laws of the laws implemented in the 19th century to again argue that, the informal sector is not something that was lay outside the purview of the state. Rather, the state kind of gave power to employers. So he uses the example of plantation labor and to argue that this kind of privatization of labor regulation or labor control was something that was done by the state, right? So the state, far from being absent, was very complicit in the process. So I mean, I just want to acknowledge that argument and to say that I have kind of tried to use that and to expand it further and apply it in detail to this particular time period, which I think is very, very crucial in understanding both the reason why the informal sector is so huge in the economy in India, and to understand our whole infrastructure of labor laws that we have had for so many decades, to understand the roots of that. So I think I'll stop with that. And if there are questions, then I can go into more detail about, specific sectors or specific examples that will illustrate what I've been saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Karuna, for that really exciting talk and walking us through the mid-20th century, the very crucial decades, as you pointed out, which perhaps historians in general have not paid too much attention to. There's this very significant gap across social economic history of looking at the mid-20th century. So thank you so much for walking us through those very crucial, transformative, and formative decades. Um, and I'm not going to summarize your talk in the interest of time, and I'm glad you did that a couple of times in terms of recap of what you were presenting. I just wanted to sort of flag a couple of questions to start with, and then I'll open the floor to the participants. One of the things that you sort of spoke about was the labor market segmentation and how it sort of changes over a period of time in different sectors. And so it would be interesting to sort of see what were those reasons that led to those kinds of changes in these different small scale industries. Then the other thing that I wanted to ask you was this connection that you made between the independent nation states project of nation building and development, which perhaps even some scholars like say Vivek Chibber and all have argued that Congress's economic policies were shaped by industrial capital. And they did play a very important role in pressurizing the state to sort of gain a lot of subsidies, but avoiding regulation, right? So how is, and you sort of went on into greater detail about how this plays out in Madras presidency with particular labor legislations. So it might just be interesting to see how you either differ from Chibber's argument or how do you take that forward. So those were my two questions, and I'll now I open the floor. But before that, I just want to know: do you want to collect questions or take one by one?
Now, since you already have two questions, let me do that, and then we can collect maybe questions 3 by 3 or something like that, so that it's manageable.
Yeah.
Okay. So regarding how the kind of composition of the labor force kind of shifts, I think it's very difficult to make generalizations. For that, one really needs to look into each separate industry. So, I mean, just to flag a few examples, maybe. So, for example, in leather, there is now work which shows. So there is Ramnarayan Rawat who does UP, and there is Shahana Bhattacharya who looks at Madras presidency, where it is clear that presumptions that leather workers in the case of UP were chamars, and in the case of Tamil Nadu were parayers. I mean, the literature kind of talks about how these were the workers because that is their traditional occupation, right? But both of these authors show that actually this so-called traditional link was built or reinforced in this time period, right? And so, for example, the parayers were not necessarily leather workers, or all parayas were not necessarily leather workers, but they are seen because of their quote unquote untouchability, and therefore their ability to touch polluting skin. They were seen as an ideal workforce, and so this was kind of built up, and they were kind of recruited with this argument that they are an ideal workforce, right? So so this was a very modern workforce which was created in the late 19th and the early 20th century, right? So and kind of Rawat draws a parallel kind of argument. So here you find a kind of labor force being built, which is shifting, right? It's not necessarily what it was. Similarly, if you look at handlooms, which is my own work, there is this assumption that handloom weavers belong to particular castes, handloom weaving castes, and they have only been doing weaving forever. But I found that in the 19th century, there were a lot of parayers who were weavers in large numbers, right? Almost 1/3 of weavers were parayers. And then by the mid 20th century, they have disappeared. And the few parayers who are there in the numbers are explained as exceptions, right? So they disappear. Then you find again from the 1970s onwards, you find 1960s already, you find new entrants to handloom weaving, and these are mostly what today you would categorize as OBC castes. So not Dalit castes, but OBC castes. So in Kanchipuram and all these places, you find a lot of 1 years coming into weaving. In Madurai, you find a lot of Bellalars coming into weaving. So the composition is again changing in the case of handlooms. So my to look at gender, for example, the example I would go back to is the BD industry, that it was quite a large number of the workers were male, right? But it becomes a highly female predominant industry by the 1980s, right? So there is a whole shift. Now, what were the reasons? As I said, for each of them, you will have to unpack what was the reasons, right? And at least for the BD industry, one of the reasons was definitely this whole thing of the attempt by employers to escape labor laws and the complicity of the state, because of which then, you know, the production kind of goes into homes, right? And as a result of which the wages are kept low, and as a result of which then men try to move and find other kinds of work, right? So there is a larger feminization of the BD industry. Okay, so I hope that kind of answers your first question. Regarding your second question, I mean, I would, so in my own work, what I'm trying to do is, so Vivek Chibbar, I think, presents a little bit of a too much of a neat kind of simple explanation that the capitalist class managed to, get the Congress to do what they wanted, right? Which might not be entirely wrong, but I feel it is a bit more complicated, and one needs to bring in, I think it's more of a three-way tussle, I would say, right? So you need to bring in the unions, the workers, and you need to bring in the larger public sphere, and then, the state and capital, right? And I think just focusing on the Congress and the center, I think, doesn't give you the full picture, because, as I said, if you want to understand the economy, if you want to understand labor, then you need to look at the region, because the region was very, very important in both transacting economic policy as well as, laws when it came to labor. And therefore, I think one shouldn't lose sight of the kind of tussle that is happening between labor, small capital, and the state. And there I would like to add one thing. So I couldn't say that in my talk, but it is not, so that is where I'm saying that the picture is not so simple, in the sense of, oh, capital won, and they just won very easily, right? And the state was throughout complicit. I think it's not so simple. The state had to respond to what the pressure from the workers' unions, right? And often it did respond. So, for example, when it actually, you see these moments when the state panics. And so, for example, when they do away with the Madras the Madras Non-Power Factories Act, and tried to extend, they tried to bring in this rule that all non-power factories with workers between 11 and 20 workers will be declared factories. And then all the employers go off to the High Court, right? Thus, the government panics. It says, oh my God, now, if the High Court, and the High Court strikes it down, then they say, oh, the unions will be on the streets. We will be in trouble. We cannot allow this to happen, right? So now what do we do, right? So, and you also find many sympathetic officials within the state government, right? So it is not a monolithic. So you find many labor commissioners who are really standing with labor. You do find, so I think it's a tussle, and at different points, the shifts are in different directions, right? So it's not a very simple story. Just to illustrate that, let me give you an example. So while, all this is happening, so it is only in Madras presidency, or not only maybe, but very strongly in Madras presidency, that there is this attempt to have protective legislation for the workers in the, what today we call the unorganized sector, right? So why is there in the first place? Because even within the state, there are people that feel that this needs to be done, right? And it is in the Madras presidency that, when they're faced with this crisis, on the one hand of pressure from small capital, on the other hand, pressure from unions and all this. So one of the things that they come up with, at least when it considers the handloom industry, is the idea of cooperatives, right? So they propagate cooperatives in a very big way. And in a sense, cooperatives becomes some way of providing some kind of protection, right? Some semi kind of formalization. So without taking on without taking on small capital directly and telling them, listen, you need to do this, they kind of find an alternate route of saying, okay, we will create cooperatives which will give, certain amount of protection to the workers, right? Now, the point is that, again, this but then you need to then look at the study what happens to cooperatives in the long run, and how it is a limited project. Obviously not all handloom workers then get absorbed into cooperatives, right? So it is a limited kind of attempt, but I think we need to recognize that as well, right? That and so it's not a simple picture of state and capital bad guys hand in hand, and that's what they did, right? But there is this constant tussle between the three, and making progress in different directions at different points is what I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And there are a couple of questions in the chat, but before I read them out, are there others who want to ask your questions personally, and we could take those first?
I don't particularly have a question, but I just wanted to say that this whole presentation was also really relatable, because if you also think about the power looms in Surat, or generally like the handloom industry in Western India, and how and what has been its growth trajectory, especially like the 19th and 20th century, I think it's very similar to how you've described the Madras presidency. Also how even in Surat, when these handlooms were transitioning to the power looms, there was no tendency to actually become bigger factories. The 5-year plans also encouraged that these establishments continue to be smaller units, and even today they continue to be registered under like the the Gujarat Shops and Establishment Act, and the state like actively tries to ensure that the power looms need not register under the Factories Act, even though they are running on power, which essentially means that they are eligible to I think the whole presentation was just very relatable in that sense, to just draw parallels between how these industries have sort of grown in other contexts as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Nivedita. Professor Karuna, if you want to respond later to this comment, but we'll take one more question. Huh? Okay, maybe till the others think of some questions. There's one question by Debulina in the chat box, which says, how do you think has the scenario changed in contemporary times in regard to the social institutions like caste, class, religion, gender playing a regulatory role in the informal sector workers' lives?
Well, I mean, I think things have changed and not changed, in the sense, as I tried to say, that it is not like these segmentations are rigid and unchanging. They keep shifting. However, having said that, caste, class, and religion play an important role in multiple sectors, right? So, I mean, if you also look at the diamond sector, for example, in Surat, with a couple of decades before, I mean, I only know studies from a couple of dates before, so I don't know the current situation. But the way the Patel caste and the Patidar caste ran a very tight shop, right, with employing only Patidars and using those caste networks to kind of control, right? And similarly, there are so many studies on Tirupur garment industry to show how caste plays an important role there as well, right? And I mean, if you look at the garment industry in Bangalore and the role that gender plays there, so, and I mean, how is it that the garment industry is so highly gendered, right? So I do think that all these factors continue to play a role, but not in unchanging, rigid ways, right? So I think capital is very, very, what do you say, flexible and accommodative. It uses all these existing social structures to organize its own systems of extraction, right? So it uses new strategies as well, right? But caste, class, and religion continue to play a very important role of regulatory role on whether it is bonded labor, brick kiln workers. Everywhere you will find all these factors still strongly playing a role, right? Yeah.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Okay. Since there are no more questions, I have one more.
Yeah.
And we can close perhaps with that if there are no more questions. But there's one request in the chat box, Karuna, which is to say if you could suggest some authors' papers to understand labor studies better. So that's one question. Mine is more to do with methodology and archives and sources. Being a historian and who works on the middle decades of the 20th century too, we know that it's quite fragmented and kind of difficult to access this time period. So just if you could share some insights for people who are gathered here also to understand how do you go about looking at certain archival sources and material, especially for this time period.
Well, for this time period, I don't know about other states, but I think Madras, the sources are quite rich. You do find, I mean, obviously the problem is that they are all state documents, and therefore you have to read them against the grain, right? Often, I mean, you don't necessarily get the direct voices of workers. But I mean, there have been attempts made by, like, for example, the Association of Indian Labor Historians to collect trade union records. And so quite a bit of that is on their website. So a lot of AITUC records, for example, have been digitized and put there. Some of the SEWA records have been digitized and put there. So I think, I mean, since you're a research organization, also this thing of collecting archives, collecting material and, you know, preserving material, I think is very, very crucial. And I mean, we have already lost so much. So whether it is oral records or whether it is archival material, I think we really need to work. And I mean, in Azim Premji University right now, we have actually started labor archive, labor repository, where we are trying to collect records and get them digitized and preserved. So, I mean, if you know of people, so recently we Handloom Weavers Union in Andhra, they have said that they are contributing their material. I mean, old journals, you know, small journals that they brought out, pamphlets that they brought out. And some of the small unions in Calcutta have also shown interest. So I think some stuff is already there. And there are newspapers, like, for example, I mean, I know more the South, right? So Janashakti newspapers that were brought out by left organizations are there, which give you glimpses into. And I mean, while I was doing my own research, we managed to go, two of my students who became my research assistant, they managed to find somebody who had written a memoir while he was underground. He was with the BD Union and was underground in 1948 when the Communist Party was banned. And so this was a handwritten memoir, right? So they found that. So I really think that a lot of this information needs to be collected and preserved. And I mean, many organizations should do it. It's not the job of one organization. So I think we should also connect. So if you know groups who would like to, you know, document their own histories, then please let us know also. I'll pass on the information, and, you know, maybe we can collect that. So yeah, so apart from going to the state archives, going to existing trade unions, and looking at existing newspapers and often reading things against the grain, I think there is a great need, because 40s, 50s is already gone, but even the history of the 70s, 80s, 90s needs to be preserved. So we really need to collect these voices and preserve them.
Yeah, thank you for sort of highlighting how significant it is to reconstruct the past, that we record these voices and bring these stories alive.
Yeah.
With that, maybe we could bring it to a close since we have no more questions.
Yeah, and Nivedita, thank you for that parallel. It's very true. And if you actually even look at if you look at the period which Douglas Haynes also, so you were talking about Surat, but if you look at further Maharashtra also, there are examples that he provides where, literally the owners are putting pardas between two looms and saying this is one unit and that is one unit. And therefore, you don't need to count me as, and the state is obviously complicit in all that. So they are telling people, yeah, you register like this, you register like that, right? So yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
it continues till date also.
Yeah, and the gig workers, not as workers, you are not a worker, is like, every day in the newspaper you hear, and the union's main struggle is that, no, we are employees and the employer-employee relationship needs to be recognized, right? So it's again, echo from very much from the past.
Okay, we have a hand raised at the end. Sheila, is it a very pressing question?
I can take it up with Karuna separately as well.
Or just
It's
go
okay,
ahead.
Sheila, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Karuna,
I didn't know you were here. Thank you.
I joined a bit late actually, so I might have missed the initial slides if they had been addressed already. But this is a question which I've been having with regard to the legal regime and how it might have affected the balance of political power, like how it might have tipped the political power in this period, in these decades. Because right now, seeing how it is playing out with regard to the curtailing of large sections of workers' access to rights and existing rights being washed out and withering away, we are seeing this is leading to a tipping of political power as well, in terms of how much influence that labor is able to wield on governments or independently on society at large. And this is something which I think is important to understand from the informal sector perspective as well, because much of the literature I have seen is mainly from the formal sector, how formal sector unions have been diluted, and this has led to certain political changes. But informal sector has not been written about so much, I think. So I was wondering if your research might have looked into that also.
Okay, so I don't have a very straight answer to that. I also used to strongly feel that, the legal regime was very instrumental in shaping politics, right? So once this legal regime is in place, in a sense, like, especially for informal sector unions, right? It becomes, so till now so there was no formal and informal sector unions. It was just people were unionizing left, right, and center. The stronger unions were obviously the formal sector unions, but everybody was unionizing, right? Jatka workers were unionizing, headload workers were unionizing, everybody was unionizing. Now, when the legal framework becomes such, and one of the main demands at that time is that, we also deserve protection, right? We also need the same laws, right? So that's one of the main. Now, once this thing gets crystallized, and increasingly, you find that handloom workers, BD workers, all these workers are kind of excluded, then the demands of the formal sector workers take center stage, right? Because that is where you can push, that is where you can argue, that is where you can demand, and therefore, at least this. So this I cannot say is like one very foolproof, and that I can prove this exactly, right? But I do see that then the large unions, right? The large political unions focus then definitely becomes the formal sector and not so much the informal sector, right? And perhaps this is why then again, so these unions already existed, but that is because they are no longer the priority, and the legal regime plays an important role why they are no longer a priority. That only in the 80s and the 90s, then, other informal sector workers unions come on the scene, more independent kind of informal sector workers come on the scene, because they say, you can't go on ignoring this sector, right? So in that sense, I do think that the legal framework played an important role. On the other hand, there is another question that some of us have been looking at, which is that did the legal framework also play a role in dampening, say, political mobilization? There, I am not 100% sure, because the timelines don't really match, right? So this legal framework comes into being by the 1940s, 50s, right? But trade union mobilization really peters out, or, the political power of labor really takes a big hit only after the 80s. Right. So, I mean, we have the huge 80s strike, textile strike in Bombay and all that. So it's only after the 80s. So there is a lag here. So how do you explain that then? I mean, it can't be a simple connection of this the legal regime coming into being and political power dissipating, right? I think there are links, but it's not a straightforward link. And I think we need to look into the larger the broader politics here of and maybe many more factors to see what ultimately defangs labor as a political force. So, okay, I don't think I gave you a very clear answer, but
helpful.
I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Karuna, for this really engaging discussion this evening. And thanks to all of you for staying till the end of the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy actually to see so many people who are working on the field, lawyers, activists. It's good to, I wish it could be more of a two-way conversation than just me talking, but I hope there will be more opportunities for that.
We'll hopefully connect again. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.